And it takes us out of time in a way, into a timelessness, I think, when we do that kind of spiritual reading at least once a day, or in those moments like when we're on the bus or when we're on the train. Or perhaps something I like to do is shut down the computer at dusk and do some spiritual reading then. It's kind of like the beginning of my day and then the end of my day.
Mm-hmm. Welcome to Read, Pray, Write, spiritual reading for modern life. I'm the host, Jean Kelly. Today we are blessed with the presence in the studio of author Judith Valente, whose most recent book, The Italian Soul, How to Savor the Full Joys of Life, offers practical guidance for living and working joyfully, as the people of Italy do. She says la dolce vita, the sweet life, is a contemplative practice that we can all emulate, even if we've never visited Italy nor lived there. Judith has actually contributed to the podcast in the past, but this is the first time she and I have met in person, and she's been so gracious to stop while on her book promotion tour. So want to welcome you, Judith. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Jean. It's wonderful to meet you in person. It was a wonderful experience on my last book, How to Live, and I just couldn't say no this time.
Awesome. That's so great that you made the time. I really appreciate that. So Judith is a former correspondent for PBS, NPR, and the Wall Street Journal. And on a personal note, her book, How to Live, greatly influenced my decision to become, like her, a lay member of a Benedictine monastery. So Judith has lived and traveled extensively in the land of her heritage, Italy. And she also leads pilgrimages to lesser-known regions and small towns where she has learned how the Italians incorporate rituals and traditions of the Catholic faith and spirituality into their daily lives, how they value a slower pace in order to savor community, and much more. And she tells us how we can all do that. And so that is what I want to talk with you about today. My favorite chapter is the one about how hanging laundry outside instead of putting in an electric dryer is a contemplative practice. So I thought we'd start there.
Well, most of us look at doing the laundry as being a chore, and maybe not a chore that we particularly like. But I found it was a really fun thing in Italy. You know, there's no electric dryers. I mean, you'll find washing machines in every apartment. And the reason is that electricity is expensive. It's not that the dryers themselves are so expensive. But the Italians love the practice of hanging their clothes in the fresh air. They say they smell better, they dry faster, and of course, anybody who's been in any part of Italy is going to remember one of the sights that you see, you know, like couples kissing on a park bench. One of the other sights you see are laundry hanging over the balconies, sometimes hanging on clotheslines, but it's often just hanging over the balconies. And so I looked forward to those days when it was warm enough. You know, you would always be watching the weather report, and if it was over 40 degrees, you would wash your clothes in the washer inside and then bring them out to hang on the balcony. And you would see, what was lovely was you would see your other neighbors doing the same thing. So it was a way of getting to know your neighbors. And then if you look at the clotheslines, you learn about the lives of your neighbors. You know, I realized that blue overalls meant that somebody's husband worked for the city, because that's what they wear. The city employees often wear these blue overalls. Or, you know, if it was a young family, they would have toddler clothes on the baby clothes and toddler clothes. And it was just fun to see other people's sheets and towels. And it's funny because I came across a stream on TripAdvisor, just by accident, where they were discussing this practice of hanging out your laundry. And one man said, you know, we don't have any embarrassment about hanging out our underwear and our nighties because we take care of them. We know they're going to be looked at by other people, and we take care of our underclothes. So it was a little daunting to put your, you know, bras out there, but eventually you get used to it.
Very good. Well, that's great. And as I mentioned, that's my favorite chapter. And Judith has graciously read that excerpt for us, that we will put in a guided meditation that will be linked in the YouTube show notes and available on our podcast website, www.readpraywrite.com. So that I was curious about, is that Lectio Divina or spiritual reading part of your personal faith practice, and is that somehow connect to your attention and your awareness that something like hanging laundry could be an opportunity for pause?
I think so, Jean. I go to Mass every day. My day begins, even here in the States, with 7 a.m. Mass, and that's my meditation time. And I do my Lectio Divina with the readings of the day. Okay. And, of course, I'm always doing spiritual readings, I'm sure, as you're doing. We're both lay associates of monasteries, so we're always trying to nourish the soul, so to speak. And one of the things I loved about Italy was there's so many churches. I was staying in a small town. My favorite place is a small town called Guardiagrele in Abruzzo. And there's only about 10,000 people in the whole town, 1,000 people only in the center, and there's 9 Catholic churches. So, there's no excuse. You could go to Mass any time, any day. So I love that about Italy. And I loved that it's people still go to church in Italy. It's said that Catholicism is virtually moribund, if not dead, in most parts of Europe. But no, I mean, the Italians still go to church, and you'll see young families and children, and as well as the elderly going to church.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So what graces do you think spiritual reading kind of gives you in any day that you might practice it as part of your morning meditation?
Well, I think that we need to step back often from our daily lives, from the hecticness and the routine of our work. We need that time to step back and remind ourselves what's really important. So let's say we have a daily booklet of spiritual reading, like Give Us This Day. I happen to like Give Us This Day a lot, which is put out by Liturgical Press, because it has the Mass readings of the day. It has morning prayer, the Mass readings of the day, and then evening prayer, and then night prayer. And it's a little booklet that you could put in your purse, you could put in your knapsack, your briefcase. You could pull it out on the train and read it. And it takes us out of time, in a way, into a timelessness, I think, when we do that kind of spiritual reading at least once a day, or in those moments like when we're on the bus or when we're on the train. Or perhaps something I like to do is shut down the computer at dusk and do some spiritual reading then. It's kind of like the beginning of my day and then the end of my day.
Mm-hmm. And that's one of the reasons I love the book, because I think it's a very easy read, very accessible, and it's very practical in that way. It's this idea that I think a lot of times I meet people like, oh, I don't have time to meditate, or I can't fit that in. I know I should pray more. And when you can find prayerful moments like hanging out the laundry,
yes,
that everyday spirituality is accessible. And it seems that the Italians have figured that out, right?
The other thing that's a big thing is the reverence for the meal table that you see in Italy. I think we eat much too fast, much too quickly in this country. We value places where you can be in and out, restaurants where you can be in and out. Well, no. The meal table in Italy is more like a Eucharistic table. It is about eating to nourish the body, but it's also about communion with the company with you at the table. And I think that's another practice, simple practice that we could use. Do we, as a family, sit down at the same time at the dinner table? I had friends with young children when I was a bit younger myself, and everybody was eating at a different time. And the kids were all eating different things because one didn't like this and the other didn't like that. And I think it's, we could make it a practice to all sit down at once and really look at eating as breaking bread, truly breaking bread.
As ritual.
And as Eucharist, as a thanksgiving for the other people sitting sitting with you at the table.
I think that sometimes the speed of our lives makes us miss these opportunities. They're opportunities that we race by, sometimes like racing and grabbing something when your kids are going to soccer practice.
Yeah. And you mentioned spiritual reading as being important. Well, Joan Chittister, in one of her books, Sister Joan Chittister, great Benedictine sister and author, talks about when we take these little pauses, we're reminded that we're really on God's time. And it's very easy to forget that. To forget that we're always in the presence of God because we're rushing to an appointment, we're trying to meet a deadline for work, we've got demands on ourselves. But it's very important to take those pauses during the day and remind yourself, really, what really matters.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And I think you've surfaced a theme that I see throughout the book, that Italians value community in a different way. And I thought we could talk about that a little bit, especially through conversation. I forget the Italian word.
Not conversatio, but chiacchiere. Small talk. Yeah. One of the things I noticed when I started to make extended stays in Italy was just how much talking goes on. I mean, they're constantly talking, but talking in person, talking in the piazzas, talking on the park benches, under the arches. In the small town of Guardiagrele, where I've spent a lot of time, the same men will show up every day at the same time at the same cafe. And these are men that have known each other pretty much all of their lives. So it creates, this talking is not just, idleness. It's to really create a sense of belonging. You're a part of a community. And if you're not there, there's a hole in the fabric of that community. And I maintain that the amount of talking that goes on, the amount of emphasis that's put on meeting in the cafes, meeting in the piazzas, also plays a really important role in our health, our physical health, because Italy has one of the longest life expectancies of any country in the world. It's number 7 in life expectancy. And only Switzerland has a greater lifespan. Only the Swiss have a greater lifespan than Italians in Europe. Do you know what the American life expectancy is in the world?
In the ranking, no.
48th. We are behind Albania, Panama, and the Czech Republic. And I maintain that it's because of the isolation. Mm-hmm. Sometimes isolation that we choose for ourselves. Mother Teresa, when she first came to this country, made a very astute observation. She said that the great American illness is not heart disease nor cancer, but loneliness. And the Surgeon General, or the former Surgeon General, just wrote a book about what he calls the epidemic of loneliness in this country. So I think the Italians are on to something about being so sociable.
Mm-hmm. And I think it actually, that we don't have the public spaces, we don't have the tradition culture that it's okay to talk to a stranger or to ask them a question. But I think there are ways to practice that. That chapter really resonated with me because I'm a volunteer for Meals on Wheels. And I see even very affluent people who have nice houses, when they kind of become, want to stay in that house, they become increasingly isolated from other people as when they just get ill or old. And I do think it makes their health decline more quickly because they're really, unless there is some great place, a senior center that will pick them up and bring them somewhere, the way we design our neighborhoods exacerbates that problem, I think. So
do this the next time you're in a Starbucks. See what people are doing. They're sitting right next to each other. You're right. You just mimicked being on your cell phone, yes, or on your laptop or your iPad. They're all in their own little bubble. Mm-hmm. Now, this would never you could never be that close, sit that close to an Italian, and they wouldn't strike up a conversation with you. There's no anonymity in that country. So don't go there. if you're seeking anonymity.
No, right. That's it. But one of the things I love about your book is you do end every chapter with some, thoughtful questions, but also sometimes an action to take. Is there something in a small way that when you honor this idea of making more connection in the smallest way in your life, what do you think would be something you could do, even if you can't talk to a total stranger at Starbucks without them, moving away from you?
Right, thinking you're invading their privacy. Well, I think look for small, random acts of kindness that you can do. I was just in New York City with my friend Jack Doyle, who's involved in the Catholic worker. He's a really great guy. Worked in social justice his whole life. And walking through Grand Central Station, if Jack saw somebody trying to take a picture, for example, a family, a foreign family, Jack would go up to them and say, "Would you like me to take a picture of your family?" Just small things. And then we were in a park in New York and a garden, public gardens, and the same thing, he saw some woman, she had her daughter with her in a pink dress. The daughter was having her quinceañera or something like that, something equivalent to that. And she was struggling, with those, what you put your cell phone on.
Oh, the selfie stick.
The selfie stick. She was struggling to carry the selfie stick and a big fat purse, and she had her little girl. And Jack just said, "Can I help you carry that?" It was simple things like that make the connection.
So, right, step one is looking up from your phone, right? It's that attention of, and that feeling of, I can help others, I can serve others. Actually, one of my favorite endorsements of the book was from a wise abbot, of course, who said, "What Judith wants for us is what Italian Saint Benedict encourages for his monks, to be the first to show respect to the other." And he goes further, which I did not know, the Latin root of the word respect, which is look again. Don't settle for a first impression. And that's that attention, I think, that looking at people differently is the first step to making those connections.
I really think that this is tied to the Benedictine value, the monastic value of hospitality. When you enter a monastery, you're probably going to see a sign on the wall that says, "All guests are to be treated as Christ, who said, 'When I was a stranger, you welcomed me.'" And look at what we have in our country now. We have this sense of them and us. Mm-hmm. And we've got to get back to having a sense of respect for one another, a sense of community that, as Pope Francis often said, we're all in this boat together.
Yes.
He would often use that metaphor of the boat because Jesus was often in the boat with the apostles. And we've got to get back to that sense of a basic hospitality, not I've got mine, you get yours type of thing.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And I think there is other elements of our culture that I think Benedictine spirituality pushes against, which is this productivity culture. And I think that's why we go so fast. And you talk in the book about il dolce far niente, the sweet do nothing. I thought maybe you could talk about some of those aspects of Italian culture that align with the rule of St. Benedict.
Yes, well, that idea of doing nothing really, really struck me because I've been a workaholic, truth be told, and an overachiever all of my life. So I probably like you, Jean. And so we have to be reminded to take time for other people, to take time for ourselves, to feed our souls. And the thing about Italy is when we talk about il dolce far niente is a phrase that's often brought up in relation to Italy. And we often, as Americans, equate that with being lazy. But that's a particularly American attitude. Italians work. They work hard. Italy is the third largest economy in Europe, beyond the UK, if you can believe it.
Wow.
There's all these small family-owned businesses, and we know that Italy puts out tremendous products. If you look at their leather goods, if you look at their food products, their cars, they put out good cars. But we have this sense that we cannot take time for self-care, that's somehow un-American to care about yourselves. But what I learned in Italy was that there's a time to work and a time to stop work. And that Italians work to live. They don't live to work. And I'm telling you, that was not an attitude I saw very often in my journalism career.
Right.
I mean, if you weren't in the office 7 days a week, you weren't a good journalist. If you weren't working 12 hours a day, you weren't a good journalist. And we've got this crazy notion that we've got to sacrifice the personal always to the professional.
And then you can also look at self-care as selfish, when in fact, sometimes that pause is that connection, that community, that to be present for your family, that you're prioritizing it. And it's hard because then you feel guilty you're not doing enough, making enough money or whatever to help your family. So I think, we can make little baby steps, right? to
little baby steps, yeah.
To realize, I think sometimes when you let go of that, you realize the world did not come crashing down right in your head. That's the rule of St. Benedict's biggest number of chapters is on humility, right? Like this idea that it isn't all about me. And, if I get off work early to play with my kids, it isn't going to come crashing down around my ears, right?
And people
not that important.
People think of monastic life as being this hopeless throwback to the past. But St. Benedict, why people like you and I are very interested in Benedictine monastic spirituality, contemplative spirituality, he was an organizational genius. He organized the monastic day equally between work, prayer, study, and guess what? Rest. And he even dared to call leisure holy.
Yeah, and that's what I love the chapters on the festivals and how it's the whole day that's what everyone's doing. Like something's wrong if you're not participating in some of the festivals, and it is holy leisure.
It's really interesting that Italians get 5 weeks of vacation. I mean, we're lucky in this country if we can get 1 week, especially if you're starting out your career. And yet often people take their vacation the same month, the month of August.
Right.
And things don't fall apart. Gee, I wonder what that's about. And the fact that they're still the third largest economy, even though people can take their vacation. In the book, I have the statistic, and if I'm recalling it correctly, I think only about 40% of Americans will take their full allotment. Even if they have 2 weeks, only 40% will take it because we think we're essential. We think the world will fall apart if we're not at our desk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a different kind of humility to learn that. You referenced a little bit some of the maybe myths about monastic life, and that this idea of pulling away from society. One of the themes that we're digging into last season and this season is the connection between contemplation and social action, and how contemplatives actually embody compassion through service. And I was just curious if you would speak to how you connect those two in your life.
Well, I was educated by the Jesuits, even though I found Benedictine spirituality, contemplative monastic spirituality later in life. But the Jesuits, founded by St. Ignatius, had the idea of being contemplative in action. That it's the two sides of the coin, like the Greek god Janus, the Roman god Janus, rather, where you have to have the balance between contemplation and action. If you're in action all the time, you're going to spiral out of control at some point. I mean, it's going to grind you down at some point. So you have to take that contemplative time. And people say, well, how do I do that? And I say, well, can you go on a weekend retreat, for example? Start with just a weekend, and then maybe make retreats a regular practice in your spiritual life, for your spiritual life. So I really think that balance has to be there. And even though I worked at real, real fast-paced journalistic places like the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, PBS, NPR, I always took that time. I always went on retreats. I always took that time for spiritual reading, and I think it made me a better journalist in the end. Because I think I was able to connect with people in a deeper way.
Okay. That makes sense, right? And it renews your own personal energy, I'm sure.
Exactly.
But the lessons, whatever you learned in the retreat, you come into the world with different eyes. And that's what I loved about knowing the respect is look again, just to look from a different perspective. And I think that's one of the things the book does, right? It lets us reflect on our culture through the lens of Italian culture and choose things that maybe we could implement in our own lives in a practical daily spirituality, right?
I think it's really important at this point in our country now because, for example, to look again at immigrants. I mean, you could look at we're getting fed this line that immigrants are somehow bad for the country and they're criminal. They're all criminals, because they've come in without the right piece of paper. But we could look at immigrants in a different way and say they renew the country constantly. If you're going to that much trouble to get here, you're crossing a river, you're crossing jungle to get here, you've got pretty good inner resources to do that. And maybe we need to stop thinking, buying into this line and thinking about immigrants in a different way. Yeah. Saying this as the granddaughter of two sets of Italian immigrants.
Yes, I do appreciate that very much. So I thought maybe we would end with just anything that you think is an important takeaway about your personal spiritual life, about the book, maybe the feedback you've been getting when you've been doing readings at libraries, anything you would like to add.
Well, two things I think I've learned, that everybody who enters your life, even if they wound you or they bring a blessing to your life, brings something to your life. Each person that we encounter brings something to our lives. And I love how the Italians are so open to new encounters. And the other is something actually that Bob Dylan said his grandmother taught him, and that everyone you'll ever meet is fighting a hard battle. And remember that, remember that when people are difficult or things aren't going right, perhaps that person's fighting a hard battle, and see if that doesn't change the dynamic between you and that person. So those would be a couple of things I struggle to do. I'm not perfect at it by any means, but it's something, those are some philosophies that I struggle to keep close to the heart.
Mm-hmm. That's a wonderful piece of advice. I appreciate that very much. So I want to allow Judith to get back on the road to home. So want to thank you for your very creative approach to contemplative life, your example as a Benedictine oblate like me, and for sharing all that wisdom in books, social media, and through your leadership. She is president of the International Thomas Merton Society. Forgot to mention that. And so in the show notes on our website, I will be linking to your book and other wisdom that you publish, including your newsletter on Substack, which I subscribe to and I love. So thank you, Judith.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you for all you do to add to the soul of the world.